All right. Welcome everyone to the first TA session on building sustainable relationships with local correctional facilities. We are joined today by Jessica and Jamila from JDI, or Just Detention International. And I apologize for that, which is good if you're able to put your phone on silent, a reminder, just happening in the moment. But I'm so happy to have them both with us today, just to really dive into the information that they were able to collect and receive from you all on what was needed in Pennsylvania so that we can really build up those relationships with corrections to better serve incarcerated survivors. So without any further delay, I'm going to hand it over to them and welcome.
Hi, thank you so much for having us. It's really such a joy to be here, or sort of here in the digital space with everyone and sharing community. As Tatiana mentioned, we're going to be talking today about some strategies and some best practices for building sustainable relationships with local correctional facilities, which I know is a huge challenge. I do not want to pretend that we're going to have all the answers for you. But we will share just some of the things that have worked for us or things that we've seen work for others. And if anyone has any questions at any time, please feel free to either type them in the chat. I feel like this is a small enough group that you could even unmute yourself if you're feeling so brave and you want to join the conversation. Please feel free to. As Tatiana mentioned, we are Just Detention International. We are a health and human rights organization that seeks to end sexual abuse in all forms of detention. We do our work in a few different ways. We work with corrections officials, with rape crisis advocates such as yourselves, and policymakers to make detention facilities safe. We promote public attitudes that value the dignity and safety of people in detention. And then we also support incarcerated survivors directly via hotline, via in-person groups, via one-on-one counseling, and via letter writing. We also work with survivors directly. Our fundamental principle is that JDI's work, behind our work, is that when the government takes away someone's freedom, that they take on an absolute responsibility to keep that person safe. And that no matter what crime someone may have done, that rape is not part of the penalty. So we'll do some really brief introductions. Hi, my name is Jessica Serrano-Seipel. I'm a Senior Program Director with Just Detention International. I come from an advocacy background, so I was a victim advocate at rape crisis centers and domestic violence agencies all kind of throughout California for a good 10 or 12 years before I joined JDI. So I have been in that position, sort of working with incarcerated survivors and having no idea sort of what to do or what the next steps are, or how to work with these systems. And so I know how challenging it can be to work with these really large and oppressive systems. And so Yamila, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Yamila. I use they, them pronouns. I'm a program officer at JDI. At JDI, I mostly do training and technical assistance, and I do some of the direct work as well. We lead therapeutic art, an art workshop program at facilities in California, and I work on the hotline and I do correspondence as well. So excited to be here with you all as always.
So hopefully everyone who's here was able to take a look at the recorded webinar, which was sort of the first step in our series of trainings with you all. Today is the one on building sustainable relationships, and Yamila and our other colleague Chris will be back next week to go over just some best practices for providing the various kinds of services that rape crisis centers can offer to incarcerated survivors. So things like hotline, forensic exam accompaniment, letter writing, in person. They'll kind of go through each of those and talk about some of the the common missteps or common challenges and in some ways to address them. But again, we're going to spend our time today kind of going a little bigger picture and talking about some strategies for building those relationships and keeping them sustainable. I want to thank everyone, especially for filling out the survey that we sent out. Gosh, I don't know how long ago that was. It feels like it was 2 weeks ago. I think it was actually several months ago. We really took, the information that you all shared with us to heart, and designed these training sessions really around the things that you all shared with us. And so, when we asked you all what some of the barriers were that you experienced in working with correction staff, these are the things that you all had shared. Just that lack of knowledge, the culture of corrections, confidentiality, the bureaucracy, accountability, all of these things that we know firsthand are major barriers in working with corrections. And so we've sort of designed today, really to address some of the things that we see the most often, and some of the things that you all have shared with us. For the chat, if there's anyone, if there's anything that isn't here on this sort of word cloud, that is a challenge that you experienced, please feel free to include it in the chat. I hope that we will have plenty of time afterwards to do some Q&A. So if there's any particular issues that maybe we didn't cover, maybe we'll have some time afterwards. But like I said, if there's anything that you've experienced, any barrier that isn't in this word cloud, please feel free to take a moment and include that in the chat for us. So this is our agenda for our 90 minutes that we have together. We're going to start by talking about understanding corrections culture, which is in a lot of ways extraordinarily different than the culture that we have as advocates, and in some ways kind of the same. And so we'll talk about what those look like. We'll talk about ways to increase buy-in, strategies to ensure confidentiality, and then strategies for sustainability. And as I mentioned, hopefully we'll have some time at the end for some Q&A. And I will pass things over to Yamila.
Yeah, so like Jessica said, we're going to kick this off by talking a little bit about corrections culture. But we want to do that by opening up this section with a quick discussion question. So we want to know from you, what comes to mind when you think of corrections culture? And like Jessica said, you can feel free to type your response in the chat, or you can unmute yourself, whatever you feel most comfortable doing. Okay, structure, yes, for sure. Zero tolerance. I'm seeing power and control. Separation, isolation. Thank you, Natasha. Oh, okay. I'm seeing a lot of different themes here. Warehousing people, money. Okay. Again, isolation and power. Strict, no capacity for humanity. Law enforcement. Definitely power. Human beings are just a number. Punitive. Punishment beyond sentencing. Okay. Yeah, feel free to keep typing those in the chat. We've gotten a lot of responses, and I think there's a lot of themes here as well. And so I hope that we're also able to sort of talk about this more broadly throughout, and how this all relates to corrections culture. But really what I want to just highlight here is that there's clear differences between professional corrections culture, right, and professional advocates culture. So some of these responses are already hinting at the fact that the expectations that we have about professional corrections culture, about professional advocate culture is not the same as the expectations we have in the corrections world. Inhumane, Sarah, thank you for adding that. Yeah, and part of this is really due to the structure. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the corrections model itself. And somebody in the chat actually mentioned law enforcement, and I'm really glad that they mentioned that, because corrections in the United States has a paramilitary structure that's very similar to law enforcement. Leadership at the top sets the tone, and then which is why it's so important to obtain buy-in from leadership. But there can be sometimes a disconnect between the executive or administrative leadership and the staff on the ground, which also makes it important to connect with these what we call line staff. And corrections in the US relies really heavily on regimentation and rules, which you all mentioned in the chat, right? In order to maintain security and safety. And everything in a facility moves by a predetermined schedule, which means that, wow, perfect timing. He always wants to chime in. Hold on, give me 1 second.
He's got feelings too about about corrections culture.
Yeah, he's got some strong feelings clearly. But like I was saying, everything in a facility moves by a predetermined schedule. So when something unexpected occurs, we can't just address it in this way, right? It actually may cause a chain reaction that leads to a wider impact. An example we always like to share is that if there's a lockdown for an hour in a facility, that can lead to things like interruptions to programming or to when or whether people eat. So these are really large disruptions caused by something that can be even minor, right? And this is also why staff may emphasize particular practices when we're in facilities. For example, staff may focus on the importance of not losing a visitor tag. And to me, that sort of seems like, okay, that's something minor, but while it may not seem like a big deal to us, losing a badge may result in something like a lockdown, which again can interrupt programming, it can interfere with predetermined schedules. And you can even, like, as an advocate, very easily be stuck in a facility for who knows how long if something like this were to happen, which is why staff may place a large emphasis on this practice, even though it's maybe not one of our priorities as advocates. And depending on your role, you may be working with anyone on this hierarchical chart. If you're working with a facility on developing a memorandum of agreement, of understanding, excuse me, you're likely to meet with administrative or security leadership. But if you're doing in-person services, you might be seeing corrections officers, which again are often referred to as line staff. And something we just like to place emphasis on is that having connections at all levels and across different departments is a huge asset to advocates. It allows us to do our work better and more effectively. But because there's such an emphasis on hierarchy, staff aren't really allowed to make exceptions, and they really shouldn't be allowed to make exceptions. So, for example, if an advocate is showing up for in-person services one day wearing the wrong colored pants, that staff may not have the authority to allow that simply because you come every week. And the people that you may be interacting with at, again, quote unquote, at a lower rank may not have the authority to make decisions at this level. So it's just helpful when we're working inside facilities to be prepared for the stringent rules that we all mentioned in the chat, right? To be prepared for those rules to be enforced at all times. And even in the example, right, about the colored pants, it may be the case that someone last week made the exception for you, let you enter the facility wearing those colors, but that may not be the case the following time. And so it's just important to plan again for those rules to be enforced. Great. So like in any subculture, right, corrections and prison culture, they have a long list of slang terms and jargon that may not be understood by people who don't work or live in those corrections facilities. So we just recommend or encourage you that if you hear staff or incarcerated people use a term or an acronym that you aren't familiar with, to just ask, right, what does that mean? There's a lot of differences in language that are both used. There's a lot of differences both regionally and even just from one department or one agency to another. So the easiest way to just account for those kinds of discrepancies is to ask people what they mean. We also use a lot of acronyms in this work, right? PRIA, we use PIO, we use, I could even be making one up, and that probably might be an acronym that is being used at a facility right now. So it's just, again, it's really important for us to just ask those questions so that we're, at the end of the day, so that we're able to better provide services to incarcerated people. And again, something that I saw in the chat was there was a lot of allusions to how isolating, how dehumanizing corrections culture can be. And a lot of the language that's used in the corrections world is dehumanizing. We don't want to pretend that that's not the case. People are often referred to as numbers or as fish or as bodies, right? Someone in the chat actually mentioned something as like human beings are just a number. And really a lot of the language that's used in the corrections world does sort of reflect that thought. And so one of the more subtle ways that we can advocate is just to avoid using this language ourselves. And we can really stick to person first language to best humanize people. And dehumanizing language is really normalized, and it's so often normalized that it can really go unnoticed. So using person first language is just a subtle but powerful way to keep people's humanity front and center. So it sounds like given the responses, I'm sort of assuming that people already know how to use this language, but this really just means saying like person with disability as opposed to a disabled person, or person in confinement or in detention as opposed to inmate. That's sort of the language that we want to use. And then we wanted to just drop a few relevant resources in the chat that can help us navigate language in this setting. So I'll drop those now.
Thank you, Yamila. I was just going to say I can't copy paste the link, so thank you.
Yeah, no, I'll drop it right now. And we hope that these sort of help you both understand the language and the reasons that it is being used, and also how for us how to center language that isn't dehumanizing. So what Jessica was hinting at the beginning of the presentation is that there's a lot of ways in which the advocacy world is different than the corrections world. And then there's also a lot of ways that it's the same. So advocates face a wide array of challenging work conditions, including funding challenges, including working against cultural forces, and being a small fish in a big pond, which means just being able to operate within a much larger system. And corrections officers face challenges like mandatory overtime, the paramilitary mindset that we were speaking to earlier, and danger of physical harm, as well as perceived danger of physical harm, and consistent hypervigilance. And right here, we're just like hoping that this can help highlight the challenging working conditions of corrections officers, and the fact that unlike in our advocacy work, there aren't really a lot of opportunities to process vicarious and occupational trauma. In a lot of ways, our agencies sort of allow for that process, or our coworkers and peers, we can lean on them for support, but that isn't necessarily true in the corrections world. And it can be easy to allow sort of the behaviors and comments of corrections staff to weigh on us, right? Or to feel like we've done something to cause this behavior. But in reality, this might have nothing to do with us personally or professionally. Corrections staff are dealing with these unique challenges at work that impact their ability to perform as we might in any given situation. But that being said, there are also a lot of things that we have in common, right? And having an understanding of these things can help us build bridges. So some of the shared working conditions that we experience is just a daily exposure to trauma. We are often working with limited resources. We are often understaffed. We have high turnover and we wear multiple hats. I'm sure that's true at any given agency, whether it be an advocate agency or corrections agency. We often deal with emergency situations. And then lastly, we see people on their hardest days. So those are the sort of things that we want to keep in mind so that, again, we're able to build those bridges. And yeah, go ahead.
I'm just gonna, we're gonna play a really short video. So let me X out of this and I'm gonna get the video up, Yamila, while you introduce it.
Yeah. So we are going to show you a short video, like Jessica said, that talks a little bit about the challenges that corrections staff face. But there's also another reason that we're showing this. It's not just to demonstrate those challenges. We also hope that this is an example of a resource that we can share with corrections that shows how staff experience burnout and vicarious trauma. And this particular organization, the Fourth Purpose Foundation. Oh, okay. Actually is an organization that's dedicated to making prison a place for transformational change. And they use language that's specifically tailored to corrections culture, which can have a more meaningful impact for staff, right? So again, like this isn't, these aren't things that advocates aren't already talking about, but it uses language that resonates with staff and corrections culture. And we hope that you're able to share this with them as well. So whenever you're ready, Jessica.
And please let me know if there's like a sound issue. I hope I did it right, but let me know if you can't hear anything.
Job burnout is a state of emotional, physical, and mental exhaustion caused by excessive and prolonged unmanaged stress. As correctional staff, you're often faced with a unique set of stressors that increase both the speed and the danger of job burnout. You work in an institution where people's lives are greatly affected by your emotional, physical, and mental health. The demand placed on you often exceeds your supply, leading to emotional detachment, callousness, and irritability. This depersonalization has the ability to follow you from work to social settings and even to your home, leaving little room to recharge before you do it all again. So, how can you combat job burnout? Start by being proactive to live fully and engage in life. Build inner strength and values that develop resistance to stress. Establish a healthy routine that you enjoy. Find help to reduce your personal stress. Exercise your mental muscles. And nurture healthy social interactions. We all know time off is in short supply, so make the most of it. Train your brain to look for the good at home and at work. And focus on your why. Why is it that you show up every day as part of the correctional workforce? You are essential, and you are helping shape an environment that leads to safer communities. So when you show up for your next shift, show up all the way. Help your coworkers who also struggle with burnout. Develop techniques that become your go-to, and help build the support needed to face each interaction. Your positivity will lead others to do the same, igniting a healthier, more resilient work environment and extinguishing job burnout. We're with you.
Sorry, let me get this slide.
Yeah,
back.
so go ahead, Jessica. We're gonna mention something.
I'm just getting the slides back up. Let me know if there's
Always a
any-
doozy.
I
But
know. There we go.
yeah, so it's really interesting because I think what is shown in that video is a lot of the work that advocates do in the community and with survivors, right? There was a set of coping skills that was offered to corrections officers, but they weren't necessarily marketed or advertised as coping skills. I think that really shows the difference in how things are often tailored for correction staff. And I just wanted to note that there's other videos that are also available at this site, which again, I'll drop in the chat. And they're all short. The videos come with a set of curriculum, different discussion questions and activities. And again, just want to emphasize there isn't anything here that advocates aren't already talking about, right? But again, it uses language that resonates more closely with staff and corrections culture. Was there anything in that video that stood out to you all? I'm just curious. Maybe you can mute yourself or comment in the chat that you said, oh, okay, this is really interesting to me, or I've heard about this multiple times, or it's funny that this was sort of posed in this way. Just any general thoughts that you may have about the video we just watched.
I'll jump in. I have thoughts. I think what I like about a video like this is that it Yamila, as you mentioned, like it talks about the things that as advocates we like really understand and that we, use in our work. But because it's coming from this corrections perspective, that it might be a little more accessible, or it's going to feel like it's really meant for them. And this is an example of a resource that as you're building relationships with corrections facilities, you can share with them like, oh, I found this resource, it's specifically for corrections, and, just acknowledging that there's that sort of occupational trauma there, but using corrections language. So again, it feels like a little more accessible, and yeah, it feels very relatable. Exactly. So yeah, if you have a moment and you'd like to, I encourage you to check out that website and just look at some of the other videos. And it helps kind of as well to just give a sense of the kinds of things that, correction staff are dealing with, at that level.
Great. So Jessica, I'm gonna pass it on to you.
All right. So buy-in, this is probably one of the hardest, well, if you're able to get that phone call back, right? This is probably the hardest next step, is getting correction staff to buy into what it is that you're selling, right? And I think that even just framing it that way feels a little weird, because like as advocates, we're not used to thinking about the work that we're doing as something that requires selling. But in a lot of ways, as we're working with corrections facilities, like we have to convince people that are reluctant to want to invite us in why it is beneficial. Like, why should they invite us in? How does it help them, right? And that sort of salesmanship or that sort of marketing is a little off. Like, we're not necessarily used to that. For us, the buy-in is helping survivors. That's it, right? But that's not necessarily going to be the thing that motivates, correction staff to want to get us involved, right? So I'm curious, again, in the chat, or you can unmute yourself, like, what are the benefits for corrections facilities in partnering with you all as advocates? What do you think they are? What do you tell correction staff they are? Like, how is it beneficial to them to partner with you all as advocates? And if you're not sure, that's totally fine too. But beyond helping survivors, which I know for us that's the motivation, but what else is beneficial for them? Any guesses? Okay, yeah, the audit, that's usually a big one, right? Could make their jobs easier. Yes, absolutely. I know I always sort of make a joke of like, oh, let us handle the feelings stuff, and then you can handle the security stuff, Yes, better support provides a safe space, builds a better community. And I like using that community word a lot with corrections, because I think it's a very isolating. It's isolating for the people that live in facilities, and it's isolating for the staff too. And so, talking about that sense of community, I think is really can be really helpful. So let's talk about what are the benefits for corrections facilities in partnering with you all as advocates. There's that subject matter expertise, right? You all are experts in trauma, you're experts in the dynamics of sexual abuse, you're experts in a lot of things that facility staff may not have expertise in, right? So even thinking beyond the kind of support that you all can provide to survivors, and Megan, I just want to acknowledge what you said about the greater likelihood for successful reentry. That's really important. But you all are also able to assist with training and assist with educational materials for incarcerated people, right? I've seen a lot of, PREA compliance managers who are tasked with making a brochure, and they share it with us, and it is not good, right? Because that's not their expertise. They're not trained, they're not experienced in developing really effective educational materials, right? But you all might be. And same with the training too. We'll talk a little bit about PREA, not super explicitly, but one of the standards for the Prison Rape Elimination Act is staff training on certain things, right? And that's something that you all have a lot of expertise in, that you can absolutely help whoever, the training people are at whatever facility you're working in, to help them make good training, right? That the resources that you all can provide are not just for incarcerated people, they're for staff as well. And I think that acknowledging that you all are not just a PREA team, right? You all are here to serve all the survivors that are in your community, that includes the people incarcerated in facilities and includes the people that work there as well. And Yamila, I think you had, or was it me, the story from Vermont? Now I'm trying to remember whose story it was, but I think a good example of this is, we work with the Vermont Department of Corrections, and we had heard from them that there was a staff person that was sexually assaulted in the community, and they didn't know, what to do, where to go, and that staff were able to connect that person to the Rape Crisis Center explicitly because of that pre-existing relationship, because of PREA, right? So it's important to also consider that, you all are providing a service to staff as well. And you can also use that as sort of if providing services to incarcerated people isn't enough, right? You can also say, we help the community as well. I mentioned reducing isolation for staff and incarcerated people. Obviously, compliance with the PREA standards is probably going to be the biggest motivator. But I think, widening the lens a little bit, why is compliance with the PREA standards important? Obviously, to prevent, detect, and respond to sexual abuse and sexual harassment, but it's also about minimizing liability for the staff. And that feels icky. Like for me as an advocate, it feels like an icky motivator. But sometimes you have to lean into what is their mindset, what is going to be important to them. To them, minimizing liability might be the thing that's going to change a mind, right? Again, for us, it feels icky, but for them, that's the carrot, right? So I mentioned PREA a little bit. Again, we're not going to go into a whole lot of detail, but there are quite a few PREA standards that explicitly talk about the need for community partnerships, or at least open up the opportunity to include community partnerships. And obviously, there's the standard regarding victim services, but it also goes a little bit beyond that. So one of the standards is 115.65, which is about a coordinated response plan. This is very similar to like a community SART, sexual abuse response team. That's something that facilities have to have within their own facilities, kind of maybe like a facility-based SART, if you will. That's an opportunity for you all as advocates to be a part of that coordinated response plan. Forensic exams and confidential support services, obviously, but also emergency medical services and ongoing mental health care. That's another opportunity to develop community partnerships for facilities. Because again, a lot of facilities may not necessarily have these kinds of services, especially like more rural jails might not have mental health staff, right? But you all as advocates might have mental health staff that can fulfill that need. As I mentioned, the coordinated response plan, let me just kind of break it down a little bit. This is the exact language right here. The facility shall develop a written institution plan to coordinate actions in response to an incident of sexual abuse staff. And then it lists kind of the various people that are, tasked with being a part of this coordinated response plan. All of these various people, these various departments, these are the people that should also be on your list of people to get in touch with, people to build relationships with, people to have contacts with. Medical, mental health, investigators, facility leadership, all of these people are important for you all to have contacts with as well. All right. So some tips for initial outreach. Now, I realize that you all here are probably at various stages of, relationship development with your facilities. Maybe you've never talked to them before. Maybe you're shouting their ears, you're blowing up their voicemail messages and they're not responding to you. So we're going to try to kind of address some tips for the various stages. But typically when you're doing that initial outreach, right, it usually starts with, with a phone call or an email. If you're working with a state corrections facility, it might be someone at headquarters. If you're working with a jail, it might be someone at the facility, or it could be someone at the larger sort of, usually sheriff's departments operates the jail, so it might be someone there. Or it could be just the actual PREA person, right? You may be able to find the PREA coordinators' information on their website. That can be a way to reach out to them. But you may also just start by reaching out to whoever's contact information you can have, just sending out like a random email into the ether. I've definitely done that before as well. I will say that it's really important to document all of your attempts. And this is something that I think is really helpful if you're finding that you've emailed, a bunch of times and you're not hearing back. I think it's a lot more powerful to be able to say, I reached out on this date and this date and this date, right? Instead of saying I've reached out several times, to be able to point out the specific dates, I think gives you a little more oomph, right? We talked a little bit about some of the differences of, just like the professional culture between advocates and corrections. Now, I think advocates, particularly now, we're used to communicating via email, right? It's just part of built into our professional culture. The importance of responding to emails in a timely manner, all of those things. Many corrections staff are not used to, one, communicating with outside partners at all, or two, using email at all, right? There may not be the same sort of like expectation that correction staff are checking their emails all day, every day, the way that we might have sort of that unspoken expectation. And so for that reason, maybe email is not even the best way, right? It may be phone call, it may be showing up in person one day, any number of reasons. If you are sending emails, I think it's really important to just be really concise as much as possible. Think of, imagine a corrections person wanting to read as little as possible. That's what I do when I'm thinking of sending an email. If I have a question, I might not couch it with the same sort of, hope you're doing well. Hi, how are you? Blah, blah, that kind of stuff that we might perceive as like friendly and professional when we're communicating with each other. A lot of correction staff might see that as just unnecessary. Get to the point, right? Ask the question. I would also advise people to avoid asking 7 questions in an email, because I promise you're not going to get all 7 of them answered. You're lucky if you get a yes or a no, right? So you want to be really concise, and every time that you're communicating with corrections, you want to try to be as strategic as possible, right? Oops, my bad. If you're already working with another system, referring to that can be really helpful as well, just to kind of show that like you are a little knowledgeable. You kind of know what you're talking about, right? You've done this before, you know how to partner with corrections, right? So if that's true to your experience, say, I've worked with such and such jail, or, I can put you in touch with, such and such facility where we've also worked, and blah, blah, blah. And of course, remember, your agency is in a unique position to help them be PREA compliant. Use that if you need to, which you probably will, right? They may be, wary of partnering with you for all number of reasons, but that PREA is pretty clear about sort of the facility's expectation that they are, quote, required to attempt to enter into an MOU negotiation. And so that is where, you all again are in that unique position. I do want to slow down really briefly just to remind folks, if anyone has any questions or any thoughts, please feel free to enter them in the chat. I want to make sure I'm not speaking too fast. All right, so you've reached out. Let's say you're in this next step where you've got your first meeting on the books, right? During these initial conversations, it's really important to to consider the other community partners that might be involved in this conversation. So like the forensic exam site, for example, right? Bringing the SART nurses or the SANE nurses into the conversation, making sure that they're also a part of that conversation. Propose a regular meeting schedule. And what I mean by that is if you have a meeting on Friday, don't end that meeting without getting another one on the books. That is sort of probably my biggest, most helpful tip if you leave today with nothing else. It seems really simple, but because we know that corrections people are so darn difficult to get in touch with, always have a meeting on the books. Even if you don't have an intention or a plan for that meeting, have one on the books. So that's sort of their way or your way of reminding them, hey, we're still here, right? So if you got a call, schedule the next one, even if it's 3 months from now, right? Just have something on the books so that they can't forget about you, right? Request a tour of the facility. And speaking of community partners, offer to bring them to the forensic exam site. Have they seen it before? Do they even know what happens in a forensic exam? They might not, right? Again, every opportunity you have to sort of build that connection to do it. So go to their facility, but invite them to your agency, invite them to the forensic exam site, get them out of the facility and connect them, right, with the folks in the community. And then, of course, begin drafting that MOU. We're going to go into a lot of detail in a little bit here about sort of some tips for that MOU process, whether you're starting it for the first time or whether you're renegotiating after it expires. But definitely be strategic as possible with every sort of communication opportunity that you have. Okay. So the facility tour, I'm assuming probably everyone on this call has probably been on a facility tour before. And one of the things is, a facility tour is it's as beneficial as you make it, right? So if you're going on a facility tour, obviously you want to think about in advance, okay, what do I want to get out of this tour, right? Who do I want to see? Who do I want to meet? What questions do I want answered, right? If you've never been in a detention facility before, there's a lot of things that you are going to need to know about, things that you're going to need to bring with you that maybe you wouldn't have thought of. The example with the pants, that's a real example. So I brought some folks on a facility tour, and one of the colors that folks are not allowed to wear is navy blue, because it's the same color that the incarcerated sort of scrubs, the same color. And so, we told them don't wear navy blue. Of course, someone showed up in navy blue. They had to wear those little like paper, almost like a painter's jumpsuit they had to put on over their pants to be let into the facility, right? And that's the kind of thing, like, you don't want to be that person that shows up with the wrong color pants. So make sure that sort of what the dress code is, wear those comfortable shoes, bring your outreach materials with you. If you have like business cards or pamphlets or whatever, bring stacks of them, not only to leave, it at the facility, but to hand out to incarcerated people as you're allowed to. And, again, with those outreach materials, are they accessible to incarcerated people? So if you're using the same materials that you would give to folks out in the community, take a look at them and say, okay, is everything in here applicable to someone who is incarcerated, right? For example, if you have outreach materials that offer resources online, that's not going to be helpful to someone who is incarcerated. It will be when they're out, right? So you don't necessarily need to delete them, but you want to include things that are going to be relevant and meaningful to incarcerated people, right? Before you get to the facility, think about all the things that you want to see, right? So if you're operating a hotline, you want to see where the phones are, right? If you're going to be offering in-person services, you want to know what are some of the locations that you can do that in. So something like an attorney visiting area, for example, is a really common one. Or if there's other programming areas like a classroom or something like that, see those places. And of course, you want to keep an eye out too while you're there for any sort of PREA-related educational materials. So for example, if there's a poster on the like a reporting poster that has the reporting information, take a look at it. If there's posters that have hotlines on there, is yours included? Is the number right? I've seen that happen too, where the number is wrong. Or I've seen where a facility puts up the RAIN hotline, for example, and they think that that's, A-okay. And, that's not at all what we would suggest. We want the local rape crisis center to be that primary point of contact, right? Think too about who you want to meet. Right. So obviously, maybe the PREA compliance manager or whoever is the person who's leading your tour, but you want to be able to meet with incarcerated people. A lot of facilities might have, and it's called different things depending on where you go, but they might have an inmate advisory committee is often what I've seen it called, an IAC. And it's sort of a group of, incarcerated people that are elected by other incarcerated people to be sort of the liaison between the population and upper levels of staff. And if there is such a thing, for example, ask, can we meet with those people? And if that's not a possibility, just go into a housing unit and start chatting people up, right? Just talk about who you are, where you're with, meet people, see sort of, show them your outreach materials, say, hey, does this look like something people would pick up and read? Does this look helpful? Ask questions, right? Make sure that you're meeting with medical and mental health staff. Those are really, really helpful potential allies for you in the facility, right? If there's any other staff that are overseeing programs, and actually that should say staff or volunteers or contractors. So I'm thinking like teachers, I'm thinking your AA people, your NA people, other sorts of, faith-based groups that are coming in, your chaplains, all of these other sort of, again, potential allies for you doing work who are already in the facility, who already have relationships with staff. Meet them, talk to them, get advice from them, build those connections. And I'll say this a number of times throughout this our time together, but it's so important that your only contact, you should not only have one contact, is what I should say, and it shouldn't be just the PREA compliance manager. You should have a list of people with various sort of responsibilities that you can reach out to for different things. So if you're new to working with corrections, they might be equally new to working with you, right? So they might have the same kind of, I have no idea what this person's about, that you might be thinking, right, about them. And any sort of stereotypes that you might have, whether they're accurate or not, right? They're probably going to have the same stereotypes about you, whether they're accurate or not, right? So learn each other's roles, ask questions and ask more questions. And then when you thought you're done, just like ask more, right? Discuss the perceptions, talk about what your perception is of the environment, and address misperceptions too. Sometimes you got to come like right out the bat and acknowledge, hey, you may be wondering XYZ, let me tell you what it's really like. A good example of that is, correction staff will often perceive or misperceive advocates as very naive, very, easily manipulated by incarcerated people, someone who will, bend the rules if needed, all of this kind of stuff. And, you all as advocates have a lot of training in establishing boundaries, right? In staying within your scope of work, in not over promising and, all of these kinds of things. Let them know that, let them know, oh, we get crank calls on our hotline in the community all the time, right? We're all trained in how to shut that down, right? Make sure that they know that, because, like I said, they are very likely to believe that you all, again, are going to be easily manipulated, or that people are going to ask you to send out letters and you're going to do it, right? So lean into addressing some of those misperceptions and highlight, the expertise that you all have, the training that you all have, and that, again, how to shut something down if someone is, messing with the boundaries or stuff like that. Any questions about any of the stuff that that I've already covered before we get into what is another really big one around confidentiality? Any thoughts or anything I've said that where you've been like, yeah, right, that's not my situation, that's not going to help me? And if not right now, please feel free to interrupt at any time. Like I said, I'm going to pass things back over to Yamila to talk about confidentiality.
Yeah. And again, I wanted to open up this section by, posing a question to you all. So either using the chat function again or muting yourself, and feel free to unmute yourself. Okay. This is a safe space. Just take some time to share some of the challenges that you face while trying to ensure confidentiality with your incarcerated clients, if any at all. If there are none, shout out to PCAR and everybody else doing the dang thing.
I have something that has come up with, so in Berks County, my supervisor and I, now we added a new advocate, but we provide virtual counseling to incarcerated individuals at Berks County jail system, because they weren't allowing people in because of COVID. So we do bi-weekly, hour empowerment counseling sessions, and we have people sign a release monthly the way that we're supposed to allow us to schedule and things. But it still feels weird to have to schedule through someone else. And also, if there's an issue with the system, like right now, last night when I tried to log on, the system was completely down. I have no clue why on their end. So like we have them sign a release so we're able to do it, but it still feels weird to have to call the jail and say, hi, like this is who I am. I'm supposed to be meeting with this person. Can you let them know like the system's down and not working? So I feel like we're not breaking confidentiality, but because of how strict all of our confidentiality, as we know, is working with survivors, it feels weird. And I know that they would obviously know if we went in person, but just doing it virtually in general, you have a sense of like not knowing if, someone walks through their background, or even you as an advocate. Usually I stay at the office and do my sessions here because I have a family at home, and sessions are usually in the evenings, but sometimes I will do it at home if I know no one's home, but still it's just trying to make sure you have the space and they have the privacy, because they don't get any privacy there. So you really want that session for them to feel like they do have that privacy and they are able to share whatever they want. So I don't know if I answered your question, but I think it's just all the dynamics of needing to communicate through the jail. Even though we have the necessary releases signed, it still just doesn't feel right,
Yeah, thank you for sharing. And I like that you added also the different challenges that come with virtual programming, because those are new and different challenges as well. So thank you, Megan. Has anyone had similar experiences or other experiences that they wanted to share? Cool. Well, feel free to keep sharing those in the chat. And I really encourage you all to attend our training. I'm going to do a quick plug for our training on September 29th, because we're going to talk about some of those, some considerations for virtual programming. And it's interesting because I think some of the challenges that Megan shared and described are also due to some degree to the inherent limitations with the PREA standards, unfortunately. And I'll talk more about that in a second, actually now, because
Sorry, did I move it too soon? My bad.
no, that was perfect. Really, there's nothing that says that communication has to be totally confidential in the PREA standards. It just says that it has to be as confidential as possible, which leaves some wiggle room for interpretation from correction staff at different facilities. And so I really appreciate Megan sharing the example that Megan shared, just because it talks about sort of those limits that we're speaking to now. However, Pennsylvania statutes on confidentiality may be stronger than what is outlined in the PREA standards and may be more explicit. And so it can be helpful to lean on this to ensure that we just have greater confidentiality for our incarcerated survivors. But as outlined here, right, these are the exact PREA standards, and we can see here that it just says that it has to be as confidential as possible. Thankfully, we have some common tools to protect confidentiality. We know that at this level of confidentiality is possible. And so while your agency may protect the confidentiality of the survivor on your end, it's also important that the facility abide by the policies that both you and the facility have agreed upon in your MOU, or even more informally, although MOU is best practice, just to make sure that we, again, are ensuring confidentiality for incarcerated survivors. And so some of these tools include having calls to the hotline bypass recording and monitoring. And it may be necessary to work with the facility's phone service provider in order to do this. And also to sort of set up maybe your hotline services so that a survivor can dial one number. There are some facilities, for example, in LA County that allow you to just dial *25 or *26 and have that call rerouted to the appropriate rape crisis center. And so that may be something that you can work on with your facility and with their phone service provider to set that up. And then you can also have set up a PIN number that allows incarcerated survivors to dial your line anonymously from any phone at the facility. And then you also want to ask staff to review legal mail procedures with you. I know that Pennsylvania has, the state Department of Corrections has different mail policies outlined for regular mail as well as for advocate mail. So you want to be able to understand those nuances and work with the staff again to review the legal mail procedures. And then you also want to utilize this tool, having officers stationed outside of the exam room or counseling space when you're doing accompaniment or when you're providing in-person or counseling services. And these tools should be outlined very clearly in your MOU so that you're able to lean on that whenever or if ever anything were to arise between the facility and you that is not protecting the confidentiality of incarcerated people. And confidentiality is at the core of what advocates do. I think it's why Megan was so clearly able to articulate why it sort of feels iffy to have a process where it isn't protected in the way that we want it to be. And we understand as advocates why it's important, but understanding the corrections perspective is also important to maintain relationships, all the while asserting confidentiality. So to advocates, confidentiality means safety, right? But very often to corrections, they feel like it's important to know everything that is happening at the facility, and not knowing can be an issue. We've had cases in which corrections staff have issues with people not reporting when an incident of sexual abuse occurs, even though that's not necessarily what the incarcerated person wants when they're requesting services from a rape crisis center. Having people in the facility or working with incarcerated people that won't report abuse to them is really unheard of for corrections officers, which is why they may be reluctant to support these kinds of services, since everyone else has to do it, right? Everyone else at the facility is a mandated reporter, with the exception of advocates, because you generally follow the kinds of policies that are set up by your rape crisis center. And so all that to say, right, that correction staff don't necessarily know how to work with someone who is not mandated to report abuse, and this might be new to them. And so understanding their perspectives helps you navigate that conversation with them. And like we mentioned earlier, right, staff may feel like they don't have the authority to make this exception. And even if you share the standards or a certain policy, a staff member may say that it is not okay to do still, which is why having an MOU is so important, again, so that we can lean on that if issues were to arise. And then it's important to try to identify what corrections officers and staff in general may have concerns about, so that we can develop our responses in response to that. So a lot of times corrections officers and staff have concerns about, right, we can't have sexual abuse happening here without us knowing about it, which is what I mentioned in the last slide. But we can respond by saying that talking to an advocate increases the likelihood that survivors will report, because they know that they have that kind of support. Corrections staff may also feel concerned that people can't enter their facility without agreeing that they're going to report sexual abuse. And then that's when we can respond with saying something along the lines of, sexual assaults advocate are the exceptions, and Pennsylvania law actually prevents me from sharing information. And then again, there's a really big concern that staff need to know everything that's happening at the facility so they can keep people safe. That's a fair concern, and something that we can say in response to that is, you know, if someone threatens to harm themselves or someone else, I'm required to share that. Just sharing the limits of your confidentiality with correction staff is important, and just an easy way to address that. That being said, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to add really quickly, just to the second piece about, you know, the Pennsylvania law prevents me from sharing information. I think that, you know, typically the language that we usually would use as advocates is like, it's a little more survivor centered when we're talking about that sort of confidentiality, that it's important for the survivor. And again, it is. But when we're talking about what's going to motivate or what's going to feel, a little more urgent to correction staff, framing it as that it's the law prevents you from sharing it, as opposed to just your own like moral or ethical obligation. Again, it both can be true, right? But framing it that way might feel a little more meaningful, or a little more accessible, or a little more understandable to corrections, that it's about the law. There's a law exists, that you are breaking the law, right? If you share confidential information, that might be language that's, easier for them to understand than the way that we might frame it normally.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what we're sharing here is sort of like, this is what we hope resonates with staff, but we also want to make sure that we're clear that these aren't some kind of like magical phrases, right? These concerns are not going to go away for correction staff just because we say what's on the right side of the column verbatim. It can just help us sort of anticipate what people might say or what concerns people have, and then how we can respond to them to ease their concerns. So I agree with Jessica. Often, talking about the law, liability, these things are uncomfortable for us as advocates, and they might actually resonate more with corrections culture and with corrections staff in general, but it might not make the concern go away completely. So this is just sort of the beginning of this larger conversation. And I really appreciate what advocates have shared in this space, because really it's important for us to acknowledge that corrections facilities are not built for privacy. Very often it's difficult for advocates to find a safe and private location to meet with clients. Even in virtual spaces, that seems to be the case. So in situations where we can't really ensure the level of confidentiality that we would like to provide, we really hope that doesn't discourage you from providing services to incarcerated people. It is important for us to just let survivors know the limits to our confidentiality, and to allow survivors to decide whether or not they want to participate in service given those limitations. And so an example of this, right, is like you may arrive to a facility to provide in-person support services and there's no spaces available. And so your options are just to offer support in a visiting area where there are other people, or to come back another time and again, look for a spot that makes sense. But instead of assuming that, this might not work and just sort of discounting it completely, this can be an opportunity to have a discussion with your client and allow them to decide next steps. They may choose to decide to continue the services rather than wait. And I think the important part of this as well is that there are so few opportunities in jail and in prison for clients to have autonomy and agency over what they get to do. So really saying you have the choice. The choice is limited to some degree, but you get to make it, I think is also an important part of this. So it's not just, it can be even more meaningful to just say like, you have a choice, as opposed to, right, like making a choice for a survivor simply because we can't ensure the kind of confidentiality that we would like. And something that Jessica and I have talked about as well is these are opportunities to build rapport and to build trust. There's a culture of not reporting, which makes sense, right, given the different kinds of things that incarcerated people face. But even so, there's a culture of not being able to share, and especially I think with incarcerated men, thinking specifically about the cultural landscape that they have to navigate, it's very hard to talk about sexual abuse, and even harder to talk about it, I think, in a confinement setting. And so allowing the people the opportunity to choose if they want to have this conversation, and even if the conversation has nothing to do with sexual abuse, the first couple of times, especially given when our confidentiality is limited in this way, they can still be an opportunity for rapport building. So I kind of danced around that, but the point being, right, that these are still meaningful opportunities, even when we can ensure the level of confidentiality that we would like. Is there anything that you want to add on that, Jessica, onto that?
Yeah, so this example of like showing up in person and there not being enough space is something that has happened to me a bazillion times. And I'm thinking in particular of one facility. It was a juvenile facility that I used to go to, and it was a pretty small facility. So there were only like, I think 2 or 3 sort of more private visitation spaces, the kind of spaces that we would, prefer to have, done services in. And I was meeting, this kid, this young boy there, and none of those spaces were available. And sort of my instinct as an advocate was to be like, well, this isn't going to work. Like, I'm not going to talk about sexual abuse with this kid in front of all of these other people that are also visiting and sort of in this larger visitation space. And I was like fully prepared to just turn around. And then I sort of realized, wait a minute, like, I don't get to make that decision, right? Like, I'm not comfortable with this. I don't like this, but it has to be the survivor's decision whether or not this is okay for them, right? And all the times that I've been in that position, more often than not, survivors would rather go through with the services and talk with you, even if it's not a purely confidential space, rather than wait. Because again, this might be like their only opportunity. And I'm thinking of this young man in particular where, he still wanted to talk. I was really surprised because I just didn't think that that would be the case. And we ended up spending almost that full sort of session talking about zombie movies, because that was the safe level of conversation that we could get to in that setting. We didn't talk about his abuse experience at all. And I remember initially kind of being like, am I just here wasting my time, like talking about zombie movies? That's not my job, right? But what it did was it allowed that relationship building to happen in a way that wouldn't have happened if I had made the decision on my own to just come back another time. By letting him make that decision, like you said, Yamila, there was just that little moment of empowerment where he was able to decide. And by not sort of making by not only by allowing him to make that decision, but then also by allowing him to lead that conversation, we luckily, I like zombie movies too, so we had a lot to talk about. But it's just an example of like, in these settings, you're not always going to be talking about the abuse right away, right? And you may have to sort of give space for other things that maybe you wouldn't have to in the community, as a way to sort of build that trust. All right, strategies for sustainability. I think this is the one that I think most folks are probably going to have a lot to identify with this. So what challenges have you all faced in maintaining sort of your consistent communication with your local detention facility? What have those attempts looked like in trying to communicate with them? I'm guessing a lot of unreturned emails, a lot of unreturned phone calls. Yes, exactly. You're shouting out into the abyss. There's no echo. Who knows if they're even getting your messages? Yeah. Any other challenges? Maybe staff turnover, right? Like you get a PREA compliance manager's email, and by the time you're able to even send an email, that person's not there anymore, or it's the PREA compliance manager is now a different person. I know that happens a lot as well. Feeling like a pest, yeah. COVID limitations, not being able to go. Yeah, I think that COVID has really, so frequently our sort of advice at JDI was always meet in person, meet in person, meet in person. And so, COVID has really kind of taken that option away from a lot of us, for sure. And I want to, Tatiana, I want to acknowledge what you said too about feeling like a pest. Like I totally identify with that, because, like when I was brought up as an advocate, like we were told, like we were trained to like, if you have to leave a voicemail every day, you're going to leave a voicemail every day, you know, like if that's what you have to do. And so I feel very much like I have just been that pest for a lot of people, but that's the kind of advocate I am. Like I will blow up your inbox every day if I have to. Like I'm not going to email you and then wait a week, you know, like I'm going to be blowing up your inbox. And that can be, you know, sometimes that can backfire, right? So I'm not saying that's necessarily what you should do, but that's definitely something I've had to do in my time. So before we kind of get a little deeper into this, like, let's just kind of remember that, you know, staff and advocates are both wearing multiple hats, are both burnt out, hopefully not, but, you know, likely many of us have been there, and dealing with vicarious trauma. We're asked to do a lot with a little, and we're constantly responding to immediate things, right? And I say that to say that, you know, for us, working with survivors is 100% of what we do all the time. For corrections, PREA is maybe 0.5% of what they do, right? So you are very low on the pole of their sort of overall concerns and responsibilities, right? So that Venn diagram is going to be really small when it comes to what the priorities are, and that just only makes things a lot harder, right? There are some tools, and it really starts with the MOU, right? So a good MOU, in my mind, the best practice would be to include a communication plan, right? So agree to quarterly meetings, for example. Is there something like that in the MOU? Having multiple facility contacts, again, I can't stress it enough. It's not just the PREA coordinator or PREA compliance manager, right? There's so many various people that are working in a facility that are also going to be working with, you know, survivors, right? So again, medical, mental health, teachers, chaplains, you know, other folks that are doing programming, volunteers, all these things. Know who those people are, include in the MOU, you know, maybe like a secondary contact sheet that lists, you know, all of those people, and include a provision in the MOU that stuff's going to be updated as there are staffing changes, right? Regular meeting schedules. Again, if you're not meeting in person, maybe you're meeting virtually, quarterly, or what have you. Inviting corrections to join your community SART, I think, is another opportunity that a lot of corrections folks are not going to have otherwise, right? And so this is an opportunity for them to become involved with their community, to meet resources outside of, you know, what you all can offer. So getting, you know, for example, relationships built with prosecutors, relationships with local law enforcement, these kinds of things. Quite frankly, an excuse for a staff person to get out of the facility, because sometimes that's going to be a motivator, right? It's like, oh, I get to go to this meeting, you know, somewhere else. How great. And then, of course, that consistency, right? And by that, I mean, you know, if you, you know, say that you're going to, you know, call someone at a certain time, that you do it. If you say you're going to follow up via email, if you say you're going to follow up with some kind of resource, that you do it, that you're always sort of following through, not only with survivors, because obviously that is like crucial to that relationship building, but that you're also following through with staff. And I know, you know, we all get super busy and there's things that are going to pop up, and, you know, corrections are used to that. Like, I can't tell you how many times I've had folks bail on me because of a lockdown in a facility, for example, right? So you want to prepare for that, but you also want to do the best that you can to avoid doing that to them, right? I think we've already talked about asking a lot of questions, and I can't stress enough how important it is to get a lot of those questions out of the way early and often, right? So all of the things that, you know, you might be thinking, the what if someone tells us that we're suicidal, what do we do, right? When will the facility notify us of a forensic exam? What does legal mail even mean? You know, who can help us secure a private space? Where should our hotline information be posted? All of those kinds of questions, it's so important to ask them for a few reasons. One, because you need to know the information, but two, it's just another opportunity to get some kind of conversation going, and to show that, you know, that you're thorough and that you're invested, and encourage them to ask questions as well. Because again, they may not have never worked with an advocate before. They may have no idea what you do or who you are. And so, you know, kind of anticipating what some of their questions might be is also really, really helpful. I'm wondering if this kind of issue has come up before for folks where, you think that you know what's going to happen, and then you realize, oh, wait a minute, I didn't actually ask, what to do if someone's suicidal, or I didn't actually, I've heard people talk about legal mail. I have no idea what legal mail actually means. Like, I'm wondering if there are times where folks have realized, oh crap, I did not ask all of these. I didn't even know what to ask, right? I think that is another reason why it's really important to connect with other advocates that are doing this work too, because you don't know what you don't know. And sometimes others can tell you sort of, oh, be sure to ask this because I wish I had asked this, when I first started or whatever. So one of the questions that I did not put on the other list is why, right? So why is a real tough one, right? Corrections culture does not encourage a lot of why questions. And I'm assuming, I am guessing that many of you who maybe have asked some why questions have gotten a, that's just how we do it, or that's the way it's always been, right? This is especially true of line staff or floor staff, right? Like, it's just not built into the culture to ask questions. They don't ask why. It's not their job to ask why, they just do, right? So you want to think about, if you're asking why questions, consider the audience, right? If you're asking line staff or floor staff why questions, they may not have an answer, or they may not have even thought about wondering why, right? But if you're talking with higher level folks, so you're like administrative leadership, for example, they're probably more used to some of those why questions, because they have to think that way. So if you're going to ask some of those why questions, again, just consider the audience. And also keep in mind that things that are new or different are often equated with being unsafe, right? So 10 years ago, someone, made a shank out of a toilet paper roll, right? And now there's some rule about how much toilet paper can be distributed. And for us on the outside, we're like, one roll of toilet paper a week or whatever it is, that's ridiculous, right? But for them, it's a safety issue, right? And so having that understanding of like where some of these things come from helps us to kind of prepare for how we're going to counter why one roll doesn't, make sense. So communication strategies, right? Do the research. There's so much out there for us to know about corrections culture and life inside and what it's like to be incarcerated. I know when I first started doing this work, I didn't take the time to do all of that. I didn't even know where to look, right? If you Google, for example, prison slang, there's a lot that comes up. Some of it is really, really helpful, right? So look into what are some of the resources that already exist, right? I already mentioned sort of being concise. I'll also say go up the chain, right? Like, if you're not getting a response from this person, who's their boss? Can you reach out to them? Who's their boss? Can you reach out to them? There may be contact information on their website if you don't know who that person is, right? Be firm, be mindful, right? And again, I'll say it again, always have a meeting scheduled. If you don't have a meeting on your calendar, you got to get one. Even if there's no purpose for it, I promise something will come up, or even if it's just a, hey, we don't have anything on the agenda today, just wanted to check in, how are you doing? It's always an opportunity. Yes, time check. We're gonna get through here. All right, so the MOU, hopefully everyone here has one. If you don't, get one. Look at other MOUs your agency might have. They might be, particularly ones with law enforcement, they might be, kind of good templates to start. We have some available as well. Keep in mind, though, that corrections agencies are often going to have layers and layers and layers of legal review and requirements. So, for us, an MOU might take a few months. For them, it might take a few years, and to sort of like be in, to anticipate that. And to use that back and forth again as opportunities to build relationships. The MOU should include a term limit of 3 years or less. And that's because it has sort of a follow-up built into it. If it's too long, then you're not going to necessarily be in communication as much as you want to. Contact sheets, a communication plan, and really, really detailed language on confidentiality requirements and limitations for both parties. So really, the more detail, the better. It should also include language really specifically about how incarcerated people will receive your information and how those services will be accessed. And then, of course, emergency contact information on both sides. These are not sort of necessarily required, but are best practice in my mind. Cross-training opportunities. So can they train you? Can you train them? And also, are there volunteer trainings that you all need to take or maybe should take before entering a facility? Prevention education. So a lot of opportunities to build relationships may not happen with direct services. It may be more prevention oriented. Facilities are required to provide PREA information, PREA education when folks first arrive. Can your agency be a part of that? If there's a PREA audit, the facility is going to know about it months in advance. Can they tell you about it too, right? Auditors are required to, part of their processes, to reach out to rape crisis centers to get a sense of, what the relationship is like, and what sort of concerns advocates may or may not have. Not every auditor is going to do that, but every facility is going to know that an audit is happening. And if you're including in the MOU some sort of notification, you may even be able to get that auditor's information and be proactive in reaching out to them with any issues. Also, incident review participation. So if there's an incident, they're required to do any kind of reviews. Maybe there's a way for the agency to be involved in that, even if it's just to make sure that that survivor at the center of that incident is being followed up with. What should not be in the MOU, right? Rape crisis centers should not be the outside reporting agency. And so any MOU should not include anything like that. It should not include any language about accepting reports of sexual abuse. And it should definitely not refer to advocates as volunteers or contractors, because again, that's going to put you all in a different reporting category as far as they're concerned. And we want to avoid that. As I mentioned earlier, term limits no longer than 3 years, again, to necessitate that recommunication. I feel like a broken record, but I got to say again, build relationships outside of your PREA contacts, and also see if there are other agencies just in your community that are working with incarcerated people. I bet you there are, and I bet you they have contacts and resources and can be really, really helpful. And to explore additional partnership opportunities. So this, may not work for every community, but I can think of some rape crisis centers where they've invited correction staff to attend their fundraising events, or they're having some sort of a community fair. They invite the correction staff to come to them. There are other ways outside of just inside the facility that are opportunities for partnership that may or may not be appropriate depending on the community you're in, but just something to consider as well. And I know I promised we would have time for Q&A, and I realized that it's almost time now. So, if folks do have any questions real quick, please feel free to reach out. Yamila and I are going to put our emails into the chat as well. So please feel free to reach out to us directly. I see my job very much as like helping the people that help. And so myself and Yamila, we are here to listen to you vent if that's what you all need. We are here to listen to you complain. We can commiserate, and we can also offer support, suggestions. Sometimes we need to come in and be the bad guy, quote unquote, and we are more than happy to come in and be the bad guy if that's what it takes to get people to write back to you. We are more than happy to do that. So please don't hesitate to reach out after this or at any time with any questions or concerns. That's what we're here for. Yamila, if you wouldn't mind copying and pasting the evaluation link, there's like a really short little evaluation that if you have a moment when we're done here to fill out, just to help us make these trainings better, we'd really appreciate it. And again, Yamila and Chris are going to be back next week to talk more about sort of providing services and some of the best practices around that. So I'm hoping everyone here can join us for that as well. Yeah, I guess that's it on our end. I'm happy to stick around a little bit, if folks have questions. I don't need to leave right away. And Yamila, thank you for posting the link to the evaluation there.
Well, thank you so much, Jessica and Jamila, for your time today and your expertise. There's so much good information. I was taking notes and giving myself reminders. So I am really thankful for you both. being here and just sharing everything that you've shared with us. And we definitely can stay on just for a few more minutes. I don't think there's anything else scheduled in this Zoom room, but if you don't have any questions, we hope to see you all back next Thursday. And yeah, if not, have a great week, and always reach out to us at PCAR and also the folks at JDI for any TA or questions. Hope everyone has a good one.